I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights I'm gaining every day. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it's Proclamation News and Gatherance. We're the prodigious, the prominent professor at PNG. It's the 3rd of January 2009. Symbolic boundaries. Very boundaries. Not of their making. Even it is a symbolic one. All views have agreed that. What's going on? Sorry about that. Got a slight error. Even Orthodox Jews have argued that it is a boundary that is not supported by the Jewish religious text and is simply being used public arena on a Saturday rather than observe traditional customs. The fierceness of the debate illustrates how powerful symbolic boundaries can be. What the ERUB also reveals is how boundaries can have different meanings for different people, depending on who makes it as forceful as a boundary that is physical and clearly visible. In the summary, this section has shown two different examples of boundaries in the city, one physical, visible and hard, permeate. The other, symbolic, being potential to allow some people in and keep others out. Page 190, Justice. Chapter 6, introducing boundaries and justice. Justice comes in many forms. If you think back to the discussion so far, the question of justice in the city is ever present. It is, for example, just and fair that those with higher incomes separate themselves off into protected residential areas. Or should governments intervene to oppose these developments and encourage people to intermingle in the residential spaces of the city? With the example of the error, you saw how different ideas about the right to create a symbolic boundary had the power to define and restrict the movements of certain groups of people on the Sabbath. Justice is a complex issue that is open to debate, with many different ways of interpreting justice or indulging what is fair. What is deemed fair for one individual or one society may not be considered fair if one takes into account the needs or experiences of another person or society. The context matters. For Nancy Fraser, a leading social scientist in the field of politics and philosophy, depicted in figure 6.7. Justice means parity of participation, or put it another way, justice means that all individuals ought to be in a position to participate as peers in social life. Fraser, 2009. Many people see the equal distribution of resources as key dimension of justice, yet the objective of seeking equality for all does not always mean distributing resources equally. As individuals and groups of individuals are different, for some to participate equally in society, they may need access to different resources or given different treatment to be on a level playing field with others. For example, special resources might need to be allocated to disabled people in particular circumstances for their full participation in social life. So it is important to remember that when justice is mobilised as an idea that applies to everyone, a universal notion of justice, there is always the potential that some groups in the population are marginalised or excluded. Women have often contested notions of justice on the basis of gender, while racial minorities have sought to show how notions of justice might only apply to, for example, white people and ignore racial and other inequalities. Page 191 in the textbook on the module DD 103. Fraser has gone to argue that, as the world becomes more globalised, it is no longer possible to treat justice in one state alone. Rather, issues of justice cross national boundaries and borders. Decisions taken to territorial state often have an impact on the lives of those outside it, as do the nations of transnational institutional investors. Faced with global warming, the spread of AIDS, international terrorism and superpower unilateralism, many believe that the chances for living good lives depend at least as much on processes that trespass the borders of territorial states as on those contained with them. Fraser's arguments here are particularly salient for the topics that you'll be exploring in the rest of this book, where issues such as border crossing or fair trade are very much situated in a wider global rather than national context. Another well-known theorist on justice is John Rawls. In his influential text, Theory of Justice, he argues, no one knows his place in society, his class, position or social status, nor does anyone know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, and the like. I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conceptions of the good, of their psychological propensities. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. They are the principles that rational and free persons concerned to further their own interests would accept in an initial position of equality, as defining the fundamentals of the terms of their association. In the activity, reflect for a moment on how you might define your own place in society compared with those around you. Do you find it difficult to imagine where you are likely to be in 20 years' time? Do you make your mind up about what is fair and on the basis of your own interests, or on the basis of aiming for wider equality? I mean, I'm sitting here doing my academic. I want my academic integrity to take me somewhere. I don't want to throw it away. I really am working hard day in, day out, as you see most days. In Rawls' view, not knowing these facts about yourself, what he calls a veil of ignorance, leads to principles that are fair to everyone. Since if we do not know where we are going to end up in our own society, we are likely to cooperate in developing a system of justice that will treat everyone fairly and which will be mutually acceptable. Rawls' views have been widely discussed among philosophers and political theorists. One critic on his position comes from Amartya Sen, another prominent theorist, who argues that Rawls' idealized theory excludes too much of what we should care about, the person's real position in the world, as well as parts of the world which are not included in Rawls' closed system of states. Multiple perspectives on justice pose interesting challenges for the social scientists as you move through the chapters that follow. Remember that justice is debated and it is your role to draw on social science evidence to interrogate the substantiate claims about fairness in the social world. In the summary, the notion of justice is complex and contested. Justice involves about redistribution and equality. Overview and chapters 7 to 10. The introduction has covered the complex natures of boundaries, which act to both include and exclude people. Two different types of boundaries, physical boundaries and symbolic boundaries. The complex and contested notion of justice, the role of the social scientist to debate and communicate, drawing on social evidence to interrogate and substantiate claims. This chapter has presented some of the challenges and tensions that characterise debate about boundaries, the different forms of boundaries in the city, which have differentiated effects on people's daily lives. It has also introduced a complex and contested notion of justice, which can be used in different contexts with different meanings. The chapters ahead will explore these issues in more detail, and in doing so, will draw on and encourage a debate of range of environmental, political and economic ideas. You'll also be introduced to several different notions of justice. Social justice. This sees justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities and privileges within the society, where social institutions such as health, welfare and education exist to enable people to live, rewarding life and contribute fully to society. Central to the version of justice is mutual obligation and responsibility in Chapter 7. Steve Garner and Sophie Watson explore the immigration borders operate unfairly to give some people freedom of movement and opportunities while restricting others. Criminal justice. This defines the institutions and practices that are concerned with preventing and mitigating crime, administering punishment and rehabilitation to those who contravene the laws of a specific country, as well as protecting those accused of committing crimes against potential abusive powers of the police, of institutions of prosecution in Chapter 8. Victoria Canning explores border criminologies and crimmigration, and you'll look at growing trends in criminalisation of immigrants in particular. You explore how the impact on women, men, children fleeing persecution and seeking asylum. I was talking about crimmigration. We're trying to analyse crimmigration without looking at a textbook. There's no answer in the textbook anyway, I'm looking at it now. Crimmigration. You've got immigrants, legal immigrants coming over to, coming in, say, for England, for example. They've got no priorities to come here, get a working visa, go out and work. All they're going to do is come here, human trafficking, selling narcotics, or distributing something they shouldn't be, some sort of racketeering. Environmental justice, environmental harms and hazards impact different groups in society in differentiated ways across time and space. Environmental justice aims to mitigate these harms through the enforcement of environmental regulations. Laws and policies in Chapter 9, George Reville explores soundscapes, and you'll see how symbolic boundaries formed through sound have differentiated and unequal social and spatial impacts. Trade justice. Look at trade justice. This concept refers to giving all countries a fair and equal access to international trading markets, because it is believed that trade is fundamental to lifting people out of poverty and distributing wealth and resources within and between countries. In Chapter 10, Katie Wheeler explores the notion of fair trade and asks you to evaluate different pathways to trade justice. Chapter 7, Immigration and Borders, People, Policies and Processes. Page 201. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you all for subscribing to the Proclamation News and Gatherings. I really appreciate it. Introduction. There are a few areas of social policy which inspire as much debate and argument as immigration. It is frequently a topic that appears in the headlines of tabloid newspapers, such as this one on the Daily Mail: Immigration. What a mess. 50,000 in Britain illegally are missing. Ministers say we'll never control our borders. Or this one, in the Sun: you are a soft touch. Immigrant on 14k benefits refuses full-time job. If you read tabloid newspapers, you might well have the impression that all British people are against immigration. Those against immigration might mobilise all sorts of arguments, such as the claim that there are not enough jobs to go around for those already in Britain, or that there isn't enough housing or welfare provision to extend access to those who have only recently arrived. In contrast, policymakers and others arguing for immigration might do so on the basis that there are gaps in the labour market to be filled, and there also is a need to increase the population. Arguments in favour of immigration vary across different historical periods and different countries. However, immigration policy is never neutral and almost always contested in one way or another, as you will see. Take a moment to note down your views about immigration to the UK and the current time. What do you think the important issues are and consider an immigration policy? Keep your notes and when you have finished the chapter, look back to see if your views have remained the same. So we're looking at population growth, looking at our national resources, being accountable for, redevelopment. Keep letting immigration people come in, giving them a visa. It's going to take up all our national resources. It's going to take up our population. It's going to multiply. We need to put a stop to it, and exactly what Brexit's idea has done. In this chapter, you'll be exploring the continuous issue of the social policy, and hopefully will become to understand that immigration is far more complicated than some of the tabloid headlines would have us think. The chapter, you look at immigration as an area for social policy and ask a number of questions. What is at stake in immigration and for whom? How did immigration become a topic that was regulated by government policies? Page 202. What factors impact on immigration policy? Throughout the chapter, you will see that immigration essentially concerns borders, which themselves are intimately connected to the nation of borders. As you saw in chapter 6, introducing boundaries and justice. Borders can be physical in the hard sense of fences and barriers, such as those cutting across the United States, where it connects to Mexico. Or the borders might be softer, with a material and physical presence, or in the form of, say, counters where passports must be shown, but where, if you have the right passport for travel, you may be quickly waved through. Immigration policy plays a key role in boundary making, acting to construct, police and defend borders. However, as you will see, sometimes those defending borders may not correspond to the geographical ones. You will also learn that borders shape people's lives in ways that are to a greater or lesser extent fair and just, as such an important component of what is called social justice. This is a term which is used in a number of different ways to describe the fair distribution of wealth, opportunities and privileges in society. It concerns public services such as education, social welfare, healthcare and employment rights, which can be led to a fairer, more equal society. Social justice can also be enabled through forms of regulation of free markets and progressive taxation directed at a fairer distribution of wealth, resources and equality of opportunity. Section 1, Immigration as Social Policy, explores colonial and European migrations. Section 2, Immigration Policy in Practice, filtering entry across borders. Look at North America and the UK in relation to the role of immigration policies in the nation building. Section 3, Policy Making at Post-War Migrations. Examples: post-colonial migration into Europe and North America, including the Schengen Agreement. Section 4, what policies does the immigrant categories, boundaries and justice consider how government policy produces different categories of immigrants, where some migrants have greater rights than others and a greater access to resources. Section 5, Control the State, border control in the 21st century, briefly highlights some emerging trends in the ways that governments manage immigration in the early 21st century. Immigration and social policy. For centuries, people have been moving from one part of the world to another, for a wide range of reasons. For example, for some people, moving to the country offers the promise of new and greater economic opportunities. For others, however, moving out of the country in which they were born in their only hope for survival. Those who live near war-torn countries sometimes need to seek refuge in another country. The patterns of movement between different countries have changed over the course of history and are shaped by different factors. For many countries, Europeans migrated to other parts of the world such as America, Canada and Australia. Since the Second World War, the direction of migration has changed as a result of persecution of poverty, and which have brought people to Europe seeking survival and safety. At one time, migrants typically had a colonial relationship with their chosen country, but increasingly as a result of cheap airfares, recruitment practices and refugee policies, there are immigration communities who have had no prior connection to the countries in which they settle. For example, countries like South Korea and Malaysia, which are economically successful and have growing labour market opportunities, and increasingly places where immigration exceeds our migration, i.e. there is net immigration. The national context where immigration takes place is always different and so important to explore. In more wealthy and developed countries, there is usually a system of social welfare in place for those who pay taxes, although this is not the case before the second half of the 20th century. Much of the heated debate about immigration, as you saw from the headlines at the start of the chapter, is around whether it is fair or not to allow migrants access to welfare resources. Yet there is another side to this debate, which does not hinge on immigrants' access to welfare benefits, but which concerns the positive benefits of immigration for general welfare of a longer established population. Many Western countries, societies of high economic development, have an aging population and a low birth rate. This means that as the population gets older, more people of working age are required to pay contributions that provide for pension and more health services. Immigrants to these countries can thus play a positive role in this regard if they are at employment. As the gaps between most developed and the most underdeveloped countries in the world grow, the stakes of crossing borders for those from at least developed countries rise. It is becoming more difficult to obtain visas to access the EU and North America, and as a result, immigration without the proper documents has increased. There has been a rise in human smuggling as people are forced into finding more dangerous methods to entry. You may well have read stories about the migrants in Calais waiting jump onto lorries at night, or even hiding themselves in the undercarriage of aeroplanes, or being packed into leaky boats to cross rough seas. People are literally dying. On a regular basis to get into Europe, North America and Australia. So while most nations' decisions about their immigration policies are often insular, there are significant global and regional dimensions to issues that are unlikely to be resolved at national levels. Colonialism and European migrations. It could be argued that the history of mankind is a history of migration. Various theories about the geographical origins of human social life suggest the people first migrated out of Africa into other continents between 100,000 and 600,000 years ago. According to those theories, the Americans were the continents to be inhabited by people, and this happened between 12,000 and 1,600 years ago. These theories give us a very different perspective on the migration that has taken place in more recent centuries, notably the mass movement of people out of Europe and the New World between 1500 and 1945. Looking back to these mass movements of early humans, the more recent migrations could be seen as an example, another stage in process that has been taking place since humans inhabited the Earth, rather than an exceptional phenomenon. Though, of course, each historical period differs and a different implication for the migrants involved. The principal direction of mass migration for 4.5 centuries was from Europe into the New World of colonies, such as Australia and the United States. Historian David Eltis, 1983, estimates that over 50 million Europeans emigrated to the Americas in the 19th century alone, and 60 million in the period of 1850 to 1932. Many of these early migrants left home, never to return. One Irish writer describes what a hard life it was. Life in Ireland was cruel. Emigrating to America was not a joyful event. It was referred to as the American wake, for these people knew they would never see Ireland again. Those who pursued this path did only because they knew their future in Ireland would only be more poverty, disease, and English oppression. Americans became their dream. They left in droves on ships and were so crowded, with conditions so terrible, that they referred to as coffin ships. Even as a boat was docking, these immigrants to America learned that life in America was going to be a battle for survival. Hundreds of runners, usually largely greedy men, swarmed aboard the ship, grabbing immigrants and their bags, trying to force them to their favourite tenement house and the exact and outrageous fee for their services, as the poor immigrants had no means of moving on. They settled in the port of arrival. Almhouses were filled with the Irish immigrants. They followed on every street. No group was considered lower than an Irishman in America during the 1850s. Estimates of total global migration to the colonial period of 1500 1945 are well over 100 million. Why, might you ask, did so many European migrate to unknown lands? Activity 2. Before reading the next section, take a moment to jot down what you think reasons might be for European migration during this period. There were many reasons for migration. A trade and commerce began to develop between European nation development colonies. Migration was fueled to people looking at the economic opportunities to take up new job possibilities and the administration of the new colonies. In many other places in America, the voluntary migrant population was supplemented, then overtaken by enslaved labour, drawn from the west coast of Africa. Indeed, migration was not always choice, and the link between punishment and mobility goes back centuries, maybe millennia. If we include the Israelites of the Old Testament, migration has always been on a spectrum between the free and unfree. The conflicts that Africans forcibly removed as slaves, and to lesser extent, the poor Europeans who worked alongside them for short periods before they were given payoffs. Indentured labour, even after abolition of slavery. People from Asia, especially India and China, migrated under similar circumstances. Unpaid labour, followed by grant of land or a cash sum. Summary: migration is a complex process that is to choose and cross borders and then settle, and lack of power to do so. Migration is by no means a neutral process. And page 208. Immigration policy in practice, filtering entry across borders. A travel document issued under the Canadian Head Tax Act 1885, despite all the migration from one part of the world to another. Historically, it was not an issue that was discussed much publicly. In the last part of the 20th century, everything began to change as migration became an object of public discussion and legislation. In other words, immigration policy was born. The first immigration policies were very much to do with race, sometimes about exclusion, sometimes about nation building. When trying to understand modern immigration policies, it is important to try and unravel the intentions behind them. At the time when immigration policies became central to public discussions, there was a dominant view that different races had different characteristics and capacities. Many believed that the current political and global balance of power reflected a natural hierarchy of races, which with people in the most developed countries at the top. As a result, such elites, such as politicians, understood the world as being mostly driven by the distinctions between people and their cultures, and based policies on them. Rationales for the economic development coexisted with the idea of either keeping your country's population racially homogeneous or expressively improving into composition. In the next chapter, you will be introduced to the notion of immigration policies as both forms of exclusion as examples of nation building. 2.1. The exclusionary immigration policies. Let's look at the first batch of immigration policies. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, United States, and the 1905 Aliens Act, UK. 2.11. The North American 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. In the United States and Canada in the 1800s, immigration legislation was federal, involving all the states. Policy and was motivated by public opinion and some labour unrest, and Chinese immigrants being employed by public works in the Pacific states, California and British Columbia. Chinese migration had been going on for decades, specifically as people were recruited to build roads and railways, while others prospected for gold, or set up small businesses, such as laundries. Campaigns against the migration streams argued that not only were the Chinese taking work from US citizens and Canadians, but also corrupting their lifestyles. US Department of State 2015. Can you think of which groups in the UK are being blamed for taking work away from the British-born people in the early part of the 21st century? In what ways are they seen as corrupting? What some call British way of life? In the comment, the groups that are blamed for taking work the British-born people are those often who have arrived most recently to undertake jobs British-born people are not placed to do. Thus, for example, many Eastern Europeans in the first decade of the first century come to the UK to work, page 210, as agriculture labourers, picking fruit and digging potatoes for very low wages. New migrants are often blamed for corrupting the British way of life when they engage in their own cultural religious practices which differ from those of the dominant culture. Page 210. Indeed, by the mid-1870s, there was already an Exclusion Act, 1875 Page Act, in a place that sought to limit the number of Chinese immigrants, which effectively linked Chinese women to prostitution and therefore a moral treat to US men. This act reduced the number of Asian women migrants. In 1882, the US government banned Chinese migration for 10 years. Though the ban actually remained in place until the 1940s. Public opinion thus had, and continues to have, an important impact on the decisions to implement policy, combining racist ideas with economic imperatives, as you saw on the tabloid headline at the beginning of the chapter. The Sun newspaper was mobilising public opinion in an attempt to persuade politicians to change their immigration policy. As the numbers of migrants to North America rose, so the need for immigration policy became more pressing. The Ellis Island, New York processing facility opened its doors in the 1890s to formalise immigration procedures. This was the busiest immigration portal of over 60 years. I mean, you can look that up on the internet, you can Google that. The Ellis Island in New York. It was to formalise immigration procedures in the 1890s. The British 1905 Aliens Act. The UK has had a long history of migration in addition to waves of settlement for other parts of Europe. London and the population people of African, Caribbean and Indian subcontinents, numbering in the thousands as early as the 18th century. The British 1905 Aliens Act was the first immigration legislation in the UK. It had a different objective from that of the United States. Here the aim was to stem the flow of the poor Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe, which was the part of the Russian Empire. who had been fleeing the pogroms, violent, concerted attacks on Jewish communities. Since the 1880s, many fled to North America and Western Europe. Some escaped to Britain. In the early 20th century, immigrants were once again seen as undercutting wages in some industries, leading to demands and lobbying by the trade unions and some politicians for immigration legislation to stop this flow. Others feared development of the ghettos in London, Leeds and Manchester, where the opponents of Jewish immigration alleged that alien customs, such as working on Sundays, were challenging for British way of life. You might have heard similar comments about migrants living in your area. The campaign gathered cross-class support, and 1905 the Aliens Act enabled custom officials to refuse entry to Jewish arrivals in the steerage class. Those with the cheapest tickets on boats who could not prove their sufficient funds to sustain themselves in Britain. The 1905 Act was superseded by a much more restrictive update in 1914, aimed at keeping out potential filth colonists, spies and subversive groups in wartime. 2.2 Policies for populating land. Not all immigration policies were aimed at keeping people out. Some were intended to draw people in, and a preference for European migrants was expressed in the UK as a result of British communism. Where countries such as India were subject to the British rule, channels were opened up for migration from former colonies. Elsewhere, newly independent Latin American states like Brazil, Uruguay and Argentina sought to expand their countries through massive immigration. In this period of overseas racial ideologies, moves to Europeanize the population by encouraging migrants were not generally viewed as empirical or unethical. European migrants were associated with industrious civilization and modernity in contrast to the cities. Few of indigenous Americans, Africans, and mestizos, those of mixed European indigenous Americans heritage, as uncivilized, backward and lazy. Argentina, for example, encouraged the immigration of Europeans in the second half of the 19th and early 20th centuries. It attracted 6.5 million, 1840 to 1930, increasing its labour force by 86% in the period of 1870 to 1910. In the United States, it was 24%. European migration to the west of the world continues to this day, mainly in the form of highly skilled migration, as the next section will explore. Still trying to get up tobacco. Still haven't given tobacco up. There's my vape break there. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. Don't try that at home, please. It's not clever. 212. Immigration and borders. People, policies and processes. The immigration policies are relatively new. Idea aimed at filtering entrance into territory and regulating their conditions of stay. The precise rationale of the filter is specific to each country's historical experiences, but racialized differences was a key variable spoken about freely, which was the case until the post-war period. Which one of these was not rational for early immigration policy? Protecting the labour market, keeping the population stock racially European. Responding to public campaigns against immigration, overpopulation. Which one of these statements about immigration is true? Race was not a factor in deciding immigration policy until the post-war period. Immigration has been a policy area since Europeans first arrived in the Americas. Britain's first Migration Act was a response to lobbying. The answer is D for question one. What of these was not a rationale for the early immigration policy was B. Overpopulation. Which of these statements about immigration is true? And the answer is C. Britain's first Immigration Act was a response to lobbying. Immigration policy involves hierarchies of power consisting of those who make immigration policies and those who are subject to them. Immigration policies were concerned with race and sometimes exclusion or nation building. Immigration policies had different rationales in different places at different times. Policy making and post-war migrations. The post-Second World War migration picture is quite different from that the pre-war period for several reasons. Large-scale immigration from developing the world into economically developed world takes off. Immigration policy constructs official categories of migrants that are internationally recognised and treated differently in the law. Destination countries have strong welfare states where benefits are available to those making contributions. In other words, the migration picture becomes much more complex and more regulated from this point onwards. Immigration policy making is not a discrete area but connects with issues of employment, residence and citizenship and social interrogations. Policy regulates the crossing of borders and the conditions under which those crossing remain in this territory. In this chapter, however, the focus is on the border crossing element of policy. Analysis of policy making tends to stress a number of factors or variables such as which actors are involved in the process, whether policies are made at local, national or supranational levels, and the immigration history culture of the receiving country. In the following sections you will look at example of policy from the EU and the UK where national and supranational levels of regulation work together. Let's think of different various types of immigrants trying to flee into the UK. What reasons would they try and flee from their country? They're living in a place of, suffering of anxiety. It's a war-torn country. They want to get out. They want to move on, don't they? They want to get to safety for their families. Some of them. Not all are coming for the good, but a lot of them are. So let's face it. When you say legal immigrant, let's not make it rational towards them because some of them are trying to get here and live in a safe environment. Trying to flee their country, not get on with their family. They want to start their life again. They want to have a life. Regenerate their life somewhere else. That's exactly what I want to do. Rather than people see it from the perspective legal immigrants and make it rational. I know at the minute we're trying to control population growth, so I'm not going to make, it is what it is. The laws are what the laws are. It is what it says on the tin, but you've got to take it with a pinch of salt when you throw it at someone in the face. Because there's all different ethnicities in our country as it stands. Don't upset anyone. Don't say it rationally. Post-colonial migration into Europe. In the post-war period, many colonial countries began to claim independence. Nevertheless, the late 1940s and into the 1960s countries such as the UK, France, Belgium and the Netherlands reunited migrants from the former colonies to help rebuild and gradually expand their countries. Migration to these countries thus built on already established linguistic and cultural ties. Those countries which had small colonial empires such as Germany developed new lines of immigration with nations which had weaker economics such as Turkey, Italy and Yugoslavia, making bilateral agreements with their governments to allow workers to come to Germany on a fixed term. Contracts in most cases, it was the ministers of labour or employment that oversaw migration. This demonstrates that, in policy terms, immigration was viewed essentially as a solution to labour force shortages at this time. European Schengen Agreement, a Union of European nations, was established in the 1950s as a common market to avoid further war in Europe and realise the free movement of goods and people. In 1986, some of the member states of the Union known as the EU, set up a pilot scheme in which international borders were abolished, so that movement between those nations was easier. This was called a Schengen area, see figure 7.3, and was later extended. Further agreements meaning that for EU nationals, movement, residence and employment within the Schengen area, plus the UK and Ireland, which are not signatories to the Schengen agreements. It is very easy. Even if you have never heard of this agreement, if you have ever travelled to Europe, you'll probably have noticed that EU nationals are given access to a faster route through passport control, where officials look at the EU documents together. What impact has this had on immigration policy? All the EU nations, to some extent, had their immigration policy set to a level above the national parliament, i.e. the supranational level. All the regulations applied to the Schengen, such as resident rights for other EU nationals, are agreed by the Council of Ministers at EU meetings. EU countries cannot easily limit the right over EU nationals to cross their national borders, while the internal borders of the EU inside Schengen area have become easier to cross to European cities, and external borders have become more difficult to cross for people without EU passports. Non-EU nationals, third country nationals in official language. You have now seen that immigration policies are rather complicated and rule-bound, but what is the reality for the people in rural places? The next section looks in more depth at the UK's policy in Eastern European migration, which should give you a better sense of in more complicated and messy realities of policy over a period of time. 3.3 Case Study: Polish migration to UK. The 2011 census showed of more than 500,000 people in the UK speak Polish, making it third most spoken language after English and Welsh, while the majority of Polish migrants arrived after 2004. What many people don't realise is that the story goes back to the early post-war period. Many Polish people ended up in the UK during the Second World War and joined the British Armed Forces, or had their own sections of them. When the war ended, many settled here and others, mainly people displaced by fighting, came on various public works schemes as European volunteer workers. In 1947, Parliament passed a one-off law, the Polish Resettlement Act, granting rights of residence of around 2,000 Polish nationals. At the stage, Poles constituted the largest single group of migrants to the UK. In 2004, the European Union admitted 10 new accession countries, 8 of which are Central and Eastern Europe. Polish people made up the majority of the migrants in all 3 of the countries that immediately granted access to labour markets that year. UK, Ireland and Sweden. It is difficult to precisely measure the inflow and outflow of the EU nationals, who no longer require visas to cross the UK. Outflow of the EU nationals would no longer require visas to cross the UK border. At the 2011 census, ONS 2011, there were just over 5,000 Poles resident in the UK, with a workforce of 450,000. However, it is important as a social scientist to interrogate the evidence presented and to question statistics that you read in newspapers or hear in the television. This 500,000 figure includes people who settle permanently, those who work for a short period then return to Poland, and those who come frequently do seasonal labour. You might well have heard stories on the Polish migrants as welfare scroungers, but the evidence contradicts the negative stereotypes. The figure also shows that people from Poland have the highest employment rate of any other group in the UK, 81.2%, which is almost 20 points higher than the figure for the people born in the UK. ONS 2014 demonstrates the migrant as a whole tends to pay more into social security than they take out, suggesting that EU migrants arriving since 2011 have added almost 5 billion into social security. Not surprisingly, There is also criticism of such surveys, which revolve around what is included or not included in the calculations. Though these more technical issues might be subject of debate, what often lies behind the discussions are strong emotions and personal viewpoints. Immigration is a subject of intense and controversial political debate. A social scientist, it is important to be aware of the way in which different political narratives emphasize different elements of data and evidence to strengthen their arguments. Page 217. Since 2004, one of the main immigration debates has concerned Central and Eastern European migrants taking British jobs and accessing welfare. At the largest national group, at least 0.5 million UK residents, Polish migrants are at the heart of this debate. Typically, these arguments flourish in times of economic insecurity, when people perceive public resources to be dwindling and perceived competition by migrants for jobs is likely to be more source of tension. Polish people are spread quite evenly across the country, with larger pockets in London, Leeds and Manchester, but also in less urbanised areas, where there was little migration in the post-war period until the early 21st century. Migrants arrived to work in agriculture. Though Polish people were seen by the UK population as generally hand-working and in some ways easily integrated. They also associated with driving down wages, drinking too much and then driving, generating mess and symbolising stigmatised ways of living. Picture of the Polish people experiencing similar ambivalent. They identify the UK as a place where they can, with the right language skills, process and make a better life than in Poland, but they face hostility and verbal and physical violence. Lee Trewick, 2010, are also aware of their position in British society, sometimes being considered white and therefore higher up racialised rightly than black and Asian British people, but also liable to categorise them backward foreigners. The experience of the Polish migrants in Britain illustrates that migrants can simultaneously be useful to the economy, placed in specific sectors in the 1940s, and then filling low-skilled jobs in the 21st century. But also the subject of controversy and hostility for some Polish people represent how EU rules for migration override those UK no controls can be placed on its migration, and therefore symbolise the state's failure to protect British workers' jobs and social security. The establishment of Polish as an important language underscores some popular arguments that the UK is changing character. After the Second World War, immigration for less economically developed countries to developed countries takes off, constructing internationally recognised official categories of migrants. The Schengen Agreement 1986 allows free movement of people in member states in Europe. Polish migrants, who are useful to the UK economy, are subject of controversy and hostility. What policy does to migrants categories, boundaries and justice? You have some idea of how rationals for immigration policy differ from one place and one time to another, even contradicting each other at some points. In Chapter 6, Introducing Borders and Justice, you will also introduce the block thing of justice, how boundaries are made, who has the power to make them, and the effects of this boundary making are questions that concern social justice because of the way they include and exclude certain people. In order to understand immigration policy, it is important to acknowledge that the policy itself creates distinctions between immigrants and these categories them as such. Though the system purports to be fair, inevitably judgments are made which favour some groups and individuals over others. In this sense, immigration is squarely in the field of social justice, whereas access to resources and freedom of movement and settlement are unequally distributed. What do you think should be the main criteria used in allowing migrants to settle in the country? Note down your answers and look back at them after you have read the whole of the section. In the next sections, you will explore the four principal categories of migrants: economic migrants, highly skilled migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, students. I'll leave it there, ladies and gents. Thank you all for listening. Please, if you don't mind, subscribe. Have a wonderful first Sunday of January. Coming to New Year, ladies and gents. If you get through this book, if I get through this book in the next couple of days, if you get through this book in the next couple of days, might finish it by tomorrow. I've got another book to read after that. But yeah, thank you all for tuning in. Have a wonderful Sunday. It's the Holy Communion Sunday. Do something active. I call it Sunday Fun Day. Enjoy yourself. Go out there, enjoy yourself. Also take care, God bless, and speak soon. One love.